I've been working on a couple of things lately, but I want to take a quick look at this because I don't think it's going away. It's just the perfect sensational story to publish, so as you can imagine, it's got a lot of mileage. One article unsarcastically began, "A little-known fact about Khamzat Chimaev," which is just laughable at this stage. If Khamzat farts in his sleep, somewhere a journalist wakes up and prints this story. Kind of a butterfly scenario, and it's mostly printed completely unchallenged, just as Khamzat presented it. So I want to take a look at the specifics and try to work out if the story is fact or fantasy, and what either case might tell us about Khamzat. So let's run through the details. According to Khamzat, in approximately August or September 2018, he took a flight from Sweden to Dublin in order to track Conor down and, in his words, catch him in the streets or at the gym and beat him up. His reason for doing this was that Conor had slept with his girlfriend. Now, that would actually make sense. His reason for going was in reaction to Conor's beef with Khabib. Beyond Khabib, Khamzat specifically mentioned Conor's insults of Chechen fighter Tukagov, who Conor called a traitor for his involvement in the Artem incident, and that Conor had claimed he knocked out a Chechen fighter in the gym. None of these individuals were friends, or at that point had probably ever even heard of Khamzat, so we're already on very shaky ground here, in terms of anything reasonable. But Khamzat claimed his mind was blowing up at the time. McGregor escaped his fate by virtue of the Irish police. As Khamzat explains, "When I was going out from the airport, they stopped me again. That time, there were guys literally in uniform, special forces, and they told me, you can't go anywhere." Khamzat spent 8 hours in his cell, and later complained they didn't even bring me food, which, in my opinion, is a very unusual detail to include. You know, if you're on a secret international mission to go to Dublin and mangle the country's biggest star, but the police intervene, would you really complain about not having received the 5-star treatment? Khamzat sounds like he was expecting a fucking menu. I'll have the Caesar starter, lobster main, and for dessert, I'll try the tiramisu, chop chop. It's not like they had him in the gulags for weeks on end just wasting away. 8 hours. He probably missed one fucking meal. I mean, he claims he was there to bash McGregor's head in. So if he's in a jail cell, he's got bigger problems than a rumbling tummy. On the other hand, if he was coming over with more benign intentions and he felt like he was unfairly detained, then the lack of hospitality may very well have been on his mind. Anyway, without even interviewing Khamzat, he was sent back to Sweden. It was like, get the fuck out of here, will you? So that's the story. It's insane. And the more you think about it, the more insane it is. It's hard to believe. But could Khamzat be telling the truth? A couple things suggest the story could be true. The first is that Khamzat would have been 24. Now, I've said this before, but the late teens and early 20s can be a horrendous period for men in terms of decision-making. And although 24 is probably a little old for peak recklessness, Khamzat was no different. According to a Russian article, right around that time, he was convicted of a violent assault. One of his friends was caught or suspected of shoplifting a pair of headphones, and he was being subdued by some of the employees, who had him pinned on the ground. Khamzat ran over and molly-whopped the fuck out of one of the staff. I think there was only one punch thrown, but it knocked the guy down. Khamzat claimed self-defense, but a number of eyewitnesses contradicted that claim. Now, we know Khamzat grew up in a war zone and in a very rough culture where boys fight as soon as they can swing a punch, and often do so in groups, so I could imagine it.
The things, like you seen when I grow up, it was hard, and sometimes some things go wrong inside, like we get angry and no control and some things like that. But actually I'm like to be nice to people and speak with the guys and help somebody. This is my things. And when I get angry, sometimes you forget many things and you become a little bit crazy.
If he saw his friend getting wrestled to the ground, he could have attacked instinctively. But honestly, I hate this story. And it's not the alleged stealing of the headphones. I just hate when people knowingly roll a dice, well aware of the best and worst case scenario, and when it doesn't land favorably, there's no sense of personal responsibility for creating the situation, for having rolled the fucking dice themselves. Go out stealing headphones if you want, but don't get caught and then beat the shit out of the guy just doing his job. I mean, for fuck's sake. I'm sure he's outgrown that type of behavior, but hopefully he's outgrown that whole mindset, because it's a terribly immature way to view the world. We also know that he was a wild man from his coach, who described his first day training where he was trying to have a full-on fight with two guys in the gym. The coach said Khamzat looked like he wanted to rip the other guy's heads off. Now that does sound like a guy whose ego could have been caught up in wanting to prove he's the toughest guy in the room. Could he have seen the situation with McGregor as an opportunity to do that on a world stage? Yeah, possibly. He's totally open about that aspect of his personality, and he's described how his brother got him out of trouble many times.
If that one was my big brother, maybe I was in some jail somewhere, I don't know. Because I'm sometimes a crazy guy and I need somebody to stop me. And the only people who can stop me, they're him. Because I love him so much and I have to listen, so big respect he is.
So he's straight up saying that if left to his own devices, he would have been capable of the type of violent criminal behavior that could have put him in prison. And we already have one example of what happens when there's no one around to stop him. You add up all those things and you might have the ingredients of the type of impulsive, unhinged behavior that could give the story some credence. And so it seems like, yeah, actually, it is possible. But there's a couple of things that really go against his story. And these things are speculative, but all these speculations really require is that Khamzat is not actually insane, and he was capable of interpreting reality in a remotely reasonable manner. First of all, the whole motive for going is absurd. He was going to defend Khabib's honor in his feud with McGregor. Now, Khabib can stand up for himself, but according to Khamzat, it wasn't only Khabib. I was coming there to protect our pride and honor. I was going there for all of us. And yeah, I just don't believe that. In this press conference, Conor probably became one of the more hated men alive among people with Khamzat's background. There were vicious attacks on core elements of their identity. But before this press conference, it was a much more personal beef. It certainly didn't involve the wider Muslim diaspora in the hypercharged sense that it later would. It was basically a sporting rivalry that had flared up on a number of occasions. Conor leapfrogged Khabib for a title shot. Khabib confronted Artem for talking shit, which then escalated into the peak madness of the bus incident. Conor did bring nationality up a couple times with respect to Artem and Tukhugov, but at this point, nationality and culture, they weren't really boiling issues at the forefront. You could argue that it wouldn't take much for someone with Conor's lifestyle and personality to get under Khamzat's skin. But actually, Conor appeared to be an inspiration to Khamzat, at least in certain regards. He's always said he respected Conor's accomplishments in terms of holding 2 belts, but he's also described first realizing the potential of the sport in terms of money and fame when he viewed the media circus Conor created with Aldo.
And you told me it was actually watching Conor McGregor made you kind of think that MMA could be your way to do that for her?
So I was working on a fight Aldo. I was look at that, it's like if the guys make so many money, like millions, why I can't do it? I have everything. I'm a fighter, I'm a warrior, like I have something inside.
It seemed like Khamzat was at least at one point an admirer of McGregor's promotional IQ. There's definitely some positive sentiment. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, at this point in the rivalry with Khabib, was there anything that would have been sufficient to make him go from kind of admiring McGregor's game to the really insane point of taking a flight to Dublin to catch him on the street and whoop his fucking ass? The answer for me is just no. Khamzat has said, I was coming there to protect our pride and honor. I was going there for all of us. But that once-in-a-century opportunity to really represent those people, it just wasn't really on the table at that point. That was only presented to Khabib in the week before the fight. So later on, maybe. But at this point, I don't think Muslim fans would have been carrying him around on their shoulders as Khamzat seems to suggest. He would have appeared like a rogue madman, and overall would have been criticized from every group. He wouldn't have been celebrated. So the only way I could believe Khamzat's story is if it wasn't about defending anyone's honor, is if it was more of a crusade on behalf of himself. Like he saw this huge spectacle, everyone's getting involved. Conor, Khabib, Artem, Tukhugov, the NYPD, etc., etc. And maybe he just couldn't bear being on the outside. He possibly thought, hey, the greatest show on earth is playing out right now. Let me just elbow my way into the center of the whole thing, shoehorn myself into the history books. That's obviously an indictment of Khamzat's self-awareness, but to me, it makes a little more sense than him selflessly going to defend the honor of entire nations, because that's a story that really only makes sense if Khamzat could see the future. no real semi-rational motive at that point in the rivalry. On the other hand, the disincentives were immense. We know Khamzat always wanted to be in the UFC.
Yeah, but when I start MMA, I always think I'm gonna be champion in the UFC. I was thinking I was gonna be like that, always.
I've also discussed at length how he was desperate to help his family. Now, if Khamzat caught McGregor outside his gym and dunked him on his head, or even just took him down on the concrete, and especially if the fight was pulled or postponed, all his dreams for the future go right out the fucking window. Khamzat would have just assaulted the main item on the UFC's balance sheet. It would have been an attack on Dana's personal finances. The UFC would have had no idea of Khamzat's own star potential, so no matter how many fights he won in Europe, he was finished in the UFC. Career over. A guy like Khamzat attacking a guy in the street and an injury is on the cards. Imagine you take that fight out of Khabib's legacy. He'd still be a star, but that fight launched him into the stratosphere. Everyone's a loser in that scenario, but without a doubt, the biggest loser would have been Khamzat. The strongest point that seems to bolster the story is that the police detained him. So one possibility is that they were tipped off of Khamzat's intentions. I don't think Khamzat himself would have been broadcasting his plan on the plane, but it's possible one of his coaches found out, did the responsible thing, and alerted the Irish authorities. But there is another possible explanation here. Khamzat had a tough time getting residency, which prevented him from competing in international wrestling tournaments.
Yeah, but because I didn't have like some papers, couldn't compete and a big world champion, something like that.
And you were wrestling in the Swedish program, but you couldn't do everything you wanted because of the papers?
Yeah, you can get like Swedish passports and you can get papers like, because you can live there, but you can get like residence, you know, like you can get that so fast. Maybe 10 years, after 5 years, maybe I'm gonna get, I don't know, We'll see.
Now, he competed in wrestling up to 2018, winning his third Swedish gold medal. So he was wrestling nationally at the highest level that year. I'd have to assume if he was eligible, he would have wrestled abroad in 2018. So it seems like Khamzat only had temporary residency and was either still an asylum seeker or a refugee. According to the Dublin regulations, asylum seekers cannot move freely within the Schengen area. Now that mentions the Schengen area, but the regulation is actually with respect to all EU members. If he had received refugee status, he would have been able to travel, but not with his passport alone. He would have needed an additional travel document issued specifically to refugees. So while it is possible his coaches tipped off the police, which would corroborate the whole thing, it could also be along the lines of illegal movement across European borders. We'd have to ask the Irish police, who, by the sound of things, are lucky they didn't get their fucking heads bashed in trying to arrest him in the first place. The alternative, as Conor recently tweeted, is much simpler. Khamzat flew to Dublin to help him prepare for Khabib. This version was initially mentioned by Khamzat himself in the original interview. Many people thought I was coming there to help him prepare for Khabib. This version just makes sense. It sounds like reality. It doesn't require Khamzat to be in the grips of a psychotic episode. There were big rational upsides here. The cheapest return flights to Dublin from Sweden are around €100, which is not a lot of money. But at the time, Khamzat had no money. His wallet probably hadn't even popped its cherry, cobwebs. He was beyond broke. He was literally surviving on the charity of others. He was living in his gym. One day they went out for a jog, and Gustafsson saw him running around like Oliver Twist with holes in his shoes and bought him a brand new pair of runners and a bunch of other shit.
Here now is a lot of guys here, like from Chechnya, Dagestan, like from Russia. They come to the gym, like they want to do something like I did, you know, like from the beginning. I have many guys like, my time to help to these guys. I'm happy to help these guys because that time was hard for me. My brothers helped me, like Gustafsson, sometimes buy for me like shoes and running shoes, you know, sometimes clothes to give me training clothes. And Reza too, all the way he did help me with the food, like with everything.
It just doesn't make sense that he'd use what little cash he had at the time to fly to Dublin and settle a beef that's got nothing to do with him. Khamzat was broke as shit, and we've heard him speak about badly wanting to change that. Well, he had a unique set of skills that the biggest star in his sport desperately needed. So it seems much more likely he was going to offer his services and finally get paid some decent cash for a lifetime of violence. Beyond an initial paycheck, if he had proved his worth to McGregor, it could have been great for his career. We've all seen what it's done for Dylan Dennis, who doesn't even fucking fight. I think his next bout is against Ariel Helwani, who recently whooped his ass all over Twitter. We now know Khamzat wouldn't need any help in terms of popularity, but at the time, a friend like Conor would have been huge, pushed them UFC doors right open. So based on what I know about Khamzat, I'd have to think the practicalities of his situation would have taken precedence over catching a little shit online from a small vocal group who aren't paying the guy's fucking bills. I mean, who gives a shit? National pride is one thing, but Khamzat still had to live in reality. So totally understandable. And with McGregor now deeply maligned with his whole way of life, Khamzat's motive for changing the details of the story would also be totally understandable. In fact, it's been genius in terms of self-promotion. The question is, would he change his story for publicity? Like, is that in his wheelhouse? Well, we do already have an example of the reverse of that. Last year, Khamzat stumbled into a kind of an awkward, one-sided beef with Khabib, who really just rolled his eyes at the whole thing. After being asked about Khabib as a potential opponent, using his own catchphrase against him, Khamzat claimed he'd smash Khabib, but he quickly walked that one back. He's tried to frame his comments within the context of the type of hyper-confident mindset a fighter needs to be successful.
He said, Khabib gonna smash you, and this stuff. If somebody say to you, it's like this, he gonna smash you, of course I'm gonna answer no, nobody gonna smash me, I'm gonna smash everybody. If you're a real man, you have to think like that.
And that alone is sufficient. But Khamzat went further than that. He clarified his thoughts on Khabib and was effusive in his praise.
This guy, we looked up to him beginning and now still looked up to him. He's become a champ. He's one of the best fighters in the world. People think I hate him. I love him because he's Muslim. I'm Muslim. It's he come some village like me, same country, like Chechnya, Dagestan, this still the same. I have a lot of brothers from Dagestan. Yeah, he's Muslim, I'm Muslim, we're brothers, alhamdulillah.
Now the reason here is obvious. Khabib is the fighter who has the biggest overlap with the fan base Khamzat is now trying to cultivate. So he felt the backlash on that one. He felt the reverberations in his own social media. And he knew he had to make that one right with those fans. You might remember he was once asked about talking a lot of trash, and he immediately cut the reporter off.
Media and the fans know you well, that you are a brush fighter, you talk a lot, but you just mentioned...
I don't talk a lot, you talk a lot, brother.
Now that response was on the tip of his tongue, ready to go, because that specifically was the criticism levied against him by those in his own fan base with regards to Khabib's situation. They accused him of flapping his gums a little too much, and so Khamzat's spin was that he just answers journalist questions. He's not actually talking trash.
There's some guy write something bad about me, Khabib gonna smash you. As I answer for this guy, but it was my wrong. But because I answered to some bullshit guy, nobody knows him.
So to sum up that little spat, he's kind of reframed his answer on Khabib as having somehow been the journalist's fault for asking the question. He rationalized it through the lens of a fighter's mentality, and he has subsequently shown Khabib huge respect. So he has demonstrated a flexibility and a willingness to play the game. And I mean that in a good way. That's a useful skill in terms of promotion. The McGregor situation, it's just the exact opposite of that. So we can't know for sure, and usually when I don't know, I tend to have a lot of caution in declaring anything too definitively. But even despite his conviction, this whole thing just feels like complete bullshit. And as a Khamzat fan, I want that to be the case. I'd be much more in favor of the idea that he intelligently and very successfully tried to spin that story for mountains of free publicity and to malign himself with the perfect nemesis, rather than, what's the alternative here? Now that Khamzat's famous, the story sounds kind of cool at first glance, in the context of the WWE-type storylines that sometimes emerge. But the reality in this case would be that he wasn't even involved in any way, and he just completely flipped the fuck out with almost no provocation, to the point of getting in a plane and trying to hunt down a fucking celebrity. That's the story. It wouldn't be Khamzat makes McGregor pay. The headline would be Lone Lunatic Assaults MMA Star. and the body of the article wouldn't be complimentary. He'd be remembered as this unhinged John Hinckley Jr. type character of MMA who wanted to clumsily insert himself into the limelight. One of these versions is insane, like get this guy a straitjacket crazy. The other version, it's actually all very reasonable and a very clever and media-savvy move which has served its purpose incredibly well. This whole video is an example of that. Here we are talking about it. So, great story, massive utility for Khamzat, but as far as I'm concerned, never fucking happened. And thank God for that.